Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a topic that really hits close to home for just about everyone in the U.S., the incredibly high cost of prescription drugs.
Yeah,
It's not just a minor annoyance. I mean, for many people, it's a genuine struggle.
absolutely. And, when you stack the U.S. up against other developed nations, the difference in prices, well, it's startling.
Startling is the word for it.
We're talking about paying, on average, 256% more for the exact same medications compared to 32 other wealthy countries.
Wait, 256%?
That's the number. Think about that. For every dollar someone in, say, Canada or Germany spends on a drug, we're shelling out more than $2.50 here.
2.5 times. That really puts it in perspective. And this isn't just about, abstract economics, right? It's impacting real lives right now.
Oh, definitely. Recent data shows that over 1 in 5 adults in the U.S. have skipped filling a prescription because they just couldn't afford it.
1 in 5. Wow.
Yeah. And it gets worse. Another 10% are resorting to pretty desperate measures like cutting pills in half or skipping doses altogether.
So people are literally gambling with their health because of these costs.
That's exactly what's happening. It's a deeply concerning picture. So our goal with this deep dive is to really dissect the core reasons behind this price gap.
Okay.
We'll be looking into the historical context, the powerful role of patents, the dynamics of negotiation, or maybe the lack thereof,
Right.
and other market forces that have kind of created this unique and, frankly, difficult situation in the United States.
Good. We want to equip you, the listener, with a clear understanding of what's driving these costs and ultimately what it means for your health and your wallet.
Exactly.
Okay, so we know we're paying a lot more, but how did this situation become, the norm? Let's maybe rewind a bit and look at the history.
Sure. Historically, brand name drug prices in the U.S. have pretty consistently been higher than in countries that use government price controls or negotiation.
So this isn't exactly new.
Not fundamentally, no. Even back in 2016, just Medicare spending on drugs alone topped $128 billion.
Billion with a B.
Billion with a B. And projections even then indicated that this spending would grow faster than other areas of healthcare.
And it's not just your everyday prescriptions, is it? We often hear about these specialty drugs. What makes them so different, and why are they such a big part of this cost conversation?
That's a great question because what's fascinating here is the disproportionate impact of these specialty drugs.
Okay.
So think back to 2015. Only a tiny slice of the population, maybe 1 to 2%, used them.
Just 1 or 2%.
Right. Yet these drugs accounted for a staggering 38% of all drug spending that year.
38% from just 1 or 2% of people. How?
Well, these are typically complex treatments, often biologics, for serious conditions like cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis.
Okay, so very serious conditions.
Exactly. Which, as you can imagine, come with some truly jaw-dropping price tags.
I remember reading somewhere that back in the late 1980s, AZT for HIV was considered incredibly expensive at, $8,000 per year?
Right. $8,000 a year seemed astronomical then. And now, now we see many drugs that might not even offer as dramatic a benefit, costing upwards of $50,000 annually.
$50,000.
And some treatments for rare diseases, these orphan drugs, can exceed $700,000 per year per patient.
$700,000. It's hard to even comprehend.
It is. And insulin is another really stark example. A medication that's been around for a century has seen its cost absolutely skyrocket in recent years, causing huge problems for diabetics.
It almost feels like the system is just set up to allow these astronomical prices. But there has been some movement towards change, hasn't there? I seem to recall hearing about Medicare finally getting the power to negotiate drug prices.
Yes, that's right. The Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed recently, does allow Medicare to begin negotiating prices for a limited number of very expensive drugs. It's a big shift.
Finally. So when does that kick in?
The first of these negotiated prices are set to take effect starting in 2026.
Okay, 2026. So still a little ways off.
Yeah, and it's important to note it's a significant step, but the extent of its impact is still kind of unfolding. Plus, there are ongoing legal challenges from the industry.
Of course. Okay, so a central piece of this high-cost puzzle seems to be the role of patents. Why do they give drug companies such a strong hand in setting prices?
Well, the U.S. patent system grants drug manufacturers a pretty significant period of market exclusivity.
Exclusivity meaning no competition.
Essentially, yes. For a new drug, it's typically for 20 years from the date the patent application is filed, not approved. During this time, they basically have a government-protected monopoly,
Okay.
which allows them to set prices with very minimal pressure from competitors offering the same thing.
20 years sounds like a long time to have exclusive rights. But I've also heard that companies often find ways to extend that exclusivity even further. How exactly do they manage that?
Okay. Here's where things get really interesting. And some might say a bit like navigating a legal maze.
Uh-oh.
Drug companies often secure numerous additional patents, sometimes called peripheral patents. These might not be on the core active ingredient itself.
So not the actual medicine part.
Right. But maybe on specific manufacturing processes or different formulations like an extended release version or even specific methods of using the drug for a particular condition.
Okay.
By creating these patent thickets, and you should really imagine trying to wade through a dense forest of patents, they can effectively block generic or biosimilar manufacturers from entering the market long after the initial 20-year patent on the drug's main compound has expired.
That sounds incredibly strategic, almost like building a legal fortress around the drug. The information we looked at mentioned AbbVie's Humira had something like 165 granted patents.
That's the perfect illustration, 165. While the main patent on Humira's active ingredient actually expired back in 2016.
2016, okay.
This incredibly dense web of supplementary patents kept lower-cost biosimilar competitors. Think of them as generics for biologic drugs. Kept them completely off the U.S. market until 2023.
Wow, so an extra 7 years.
7 years in the U.S. Now consider this. In Europe, where far fewer of these additional patents were granted or upheld,
Right.
biosimilars for Humira became available 5 years earlier, some as early as 2018.
5 years sooner in Europe.
Exactly. And during those extra years of market exclusivity just in the U.S., AbbVie generated, get this, a staggering $114 billion in revenue from Humira alone.
114 billion just from Humira in those extra years.
Just from Humira, just in the U.S., largely thanks to that extended patent protection. It shows the massive financial impact.
That's almost unimaginable. And there's a term for this practice of extending patent protection, isn't there? Something like evergreening.
Precisely. Evergreening describes exactly that tactic. Patenting minor, often non-therapeutic changes to a drug. Maybe it's a slight alteration of the pill's coating or a new dosage form purely to extend its market exclusivity.
So not necessarily making the drug better, just different enough for a new patent.
Often, yes. And this can also lead to something called product hopping, where companies might encourage doctors and patients to switch to the newly patented version just before the original patent expires, further hindering the uptake of cheaper generics when they finally arrive.
That feels sneaky.
It's certainly controversial, and research backs this up. One group, IMAA, found that on average, top-selling drugs in 2021 had 74 granted patents each.
74 patents per drug.
On average for the top sellers, yes. And remarkably, they found that about 2/3 of those patent applications were filed after the drug had already received FDA approval.
So they get the drug approved, then keep adding patents later.
Seems to be a common strategy to maximize that exclusivity window.
Okay, so fewer competitors in the market directly translates to higher prices for consumers. Seems like a pretty direct line.
It really does.
And speaking of competition, or maybe the lack thereof, the U.S. government's role or historical lack of a role in negotiating drug prices seems like another critical factor.
Absolutely critical. Unlike many other developed nations where the government directly negotiates drug prices, especially within their national health systems.
Like in Canada or the UK.
Exactly. The U.S. government, specifically Medicare, which is the largest single purchaser of drugs in the country, has historically been prohibited by law from doing so.
Prohibited? Why?
Well, that restriction was largely the result of very significant and effective lobbying efforts by the pharmaceutical industry over the years.
Which seems to defy common sense, doesn't it? You'd think a massive buyer like Medicare would have incredible bargaining power to push prices down.
You would absolutely think so. And look at the evidence. The Veterans Affairs VA system, which is allowed to negotiate drug prices.
Ah, the VA does negotiate.
Yes, they do. And the VA, along with healthcare systems in other countries, consistently pay less, sometimes significantly less, for the exact same medications.
So the negotiating power works where it's allowed.
It certainly appears that way.
Yeah.
Medicare's inability to negotiate for decades has been a major contributing factor to the higher prices we see across the board in the U.S. The Inflation Reduction Act, as we mentioned, is that initial step towards changing this, but its scope is currently limited to just a handful of drugs.
Okay, so we have patents and patent thickets, and we have this historical lack of negotiation. Beyond those big two, What other elements are contributing to these sky-high drug costs? It can't solely be down to those two factors, surely.
No, you're right. There are definitely other intertwined factors at play. One very significant driver is, well, simply the profit motive of the drug companies.
Okay, making money.
Right. As publicly traded entities, their primary responsibility is often framed as maximizing shareholder value, and the pricing power they've enjoyed in the unique U.S. market has certainly allowed for substantial profit margins.
Yes, substantial are we talking?
Well, one analysis suggested something pretty striking, that the revenue generated just for the price difference between the U.S. and other comparable countries for only the top 20 selling drugs.
Just the top 20.
Yes. That price difference alone would be enough to cover their entire global research and development expenses, with billions of dollars left over.
Jillions left over. That's mind-blowing. It really makes you question the argument that high prices are solely necessary to fund crucial R&D.
Precisely. And while the industry often argues quite forcefully that high prices are absolutely essential to fund the very risky and expensive process of drug development.
Which is expensive, no doubt.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It is true that only a small fraction of drugs that even enter clinical trials ultimately gain FDA approval. It's a tough business. But the direct and sort of exclusive link claimed between today's high prices and funding tomorrow's cures is a subject of pretty intense ongoing debate.
Okay. What else? I keep hearing about pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs. They sound important, but kind of mysterious.
Yes, PBMs are often described as the behind-the-scenes players, the intermediaries in all of this.
Intermediaries between who?
Between the drug manufacturers, the health insurers, and also large employers. They manage prescription drug benefits. They negotiate rebates and discounts with drug companies.
So they're supposed to save money.
That's the idea. But their role is complex and often lacks transparency. They often employ strategies like spread pricing, where they charge the health plan more than they reimburse the pharmacy, and they receive significant rebates from drug manufacturers.
Rebates? Like kickbacks?
Well, rebate is the industry term, but the transparency around these rebates and their ultimate impact on the final drug costs that you face at the pharmacy counter is highly debated.
How so?
Some argue that the way these rebates are structured might actually incentivize PBMs to favor more expensive drugs on their formularies, the list of covered drugs, because those drugs come with higher rebates for the PBM.
Wait, so they might prefer a more expensive drug if they get a bigger rebate, even if a cheaper one is available.
That's the concern raised by critics, that the incentive isn't necessarily aligned with getting the lowest net cost for the patient or the health plan. It's a very opaque system.
Okay, that sounds complicated. And what about generic drugs? They're supposed to be the affordable alternatives, right? But even that market seems to have its own set of issues.
It does. The generic drug market definitely faces its own challenges, which can limit the savings consumers expect.
Like what?
Well, sometimes there are delays in the FDA approval process for generic drugs, which obviously limits their timely availability. Then there have also been instances of something called pay-for-delay agreements.
Pay for delay? What's that?
That's where a brand name company essentially pays a potential generic manufacturer not to launch their cheaper version for a certain period, even after the generic company might have won a patent challenge.
So the brand pays the generic to stay away.
Effectively, yes, to keep their monopoly going longer. And unfortunately, there have even been allegations and some settlements related to price fixing among certain generic drug manufacturers themselves.
Price fixing among generics. Aren't they supposed to compete to lower prices?
They are, but if competitors collude, that obviously undermines the whole point. So all of these things can chip away at the cost-saving potential of generics.
Okay. And then we have orphan drugs, those medications for rare diseases. I understand the need to incentivize companies to develop them, but their prices can just be astronomical.
Yes. The Orphan Drug Act of 1983 provides crucial incentives like tax credits, grants, and extended market exclusivity for developing treatments for rare diseases affecting fewer than 200,000 Americans.
Which sounds like a good thing.
It absolutely is vital. Without it, many treatments for rare conditions likely wouldn't exist. However, because the patient populations are by definition small and there are often no alternative treatments available, companies can, and often do, command extraordinarily high prices for these orphan drugs.
Hundreds of thousands, as you said earlier.
Sometimes even more. And while insurance often covers a significant portion, it still puts a massive strain on the overall healthcare system's finances, and patients can still face huge out-of-pocket costs.
Right. And one last factor, marketing, lobbying.
Absolutely cannot ignore those. The pharmaceutical industry spends enormous sums on direct-to-consumer advertising, which is unusual globally, by the way,
We see those ads all the time.
all the time. And also on marketing to physicians, plus vast amounts on lobbying policymakers in Washington, D.C. and state capitals. This spending undoubtedly plays a role in influencing prescribing practices and shaping healthcare policy in ways favorable to the industry.
Okay, wow. That's quite a list of factors. This paints a pretty concerning picture regarding the sheer affordability of medications.
Yeah.
What are the tangible consequences for individuals, for you listening, trying to access the treatments they need?
The real-world consequences are significant, and frankly, they raise serious ethical questions. High costs directly restrict access to necessary treatments.
Even if you have insurance.
Yes, even for people who have health insurance.
Yeah.
It happens through high deductibles, high copays, and also the often burdensome requirements for prior authorization.
Ah, prior authorization, the bane of many people's existence.
Indeed. And it's not just annoying. A shocking 75% of physicians, in one survey, reported that these prior authorization processes can actually lead to patients completely abandoning essential treatment altogether because it's too difficult or takes too long.
75%, that's staggering. People are being denied the care they need or giving up simply due to bureaucratic hurdles and cost.
That seems to be the case far too often. And as we discussed earlier, many patients resort to self-rationing their medication because of cost.
The pill splitting, the skip doses.
Exactly, which can lead to serious, predictable, and sometimes even life-threatening health outcomes. Studies consistently show a significant percentage of patients struggling to afford their meds and ending up foregoing them altogether. We mentioned 1 in 5 earlier not filling a script.
Yeah.
And it's not just the impact on patients directly. These high costs and complex systems also create substantial administrative burdens for physicians and their staff.
More paperwork, less time with patients.
Precisely. Doctors report spending countless hours navigating prior authorizations, dealing with formulary restrictions, time that's diverted from direct patient care. And that contributes significantly to physician burnout, which is another growing crisis.
It sounds like the system in many ways just creates these unnecessary obstacles to actually getting and providing health care.
That's a fair assessment from many perspectives. In many respects, the current system leads to an inevitable kind of rationing of healthcare resources.
Rationing. That sounds scary.
Well, it can be. Sometimes it's explicit, like an insurance company refusing to cover a certain expensive drug. Other times it's more implicit, maybe long waiting times for specialist appointments because the system is strained, or physicians having less time to spend with each patient due to administrative load.
Okay, I see.
While the idea of rationing in healthcare often carries very negative connotations, the sort of uncomfortable reality is that with finite resources, money, time, personnel choices have to be made about who gets what care and when.
So the question isn't if we ration, but how.
Exactly. The critical question we face is whether our current system of rationing, which is driven in large part by these extremely high drug costs, is equitable, is efficient, and is just.
A lot to think about there. So, given all these challenges, this complex web we've described, what are some of the potential solutions or policy considerations that could actually help bring down prescription drug prices?
Well, there's no single silver bullet, unfortunately. No single easy fix. But a comprehensive approach involving multiple strategies is probably necessary.
Okay, like what?
Government negotiation of drug prices, as initiated by the Inflation Reduction Act, is seen by many as a crucial element. And polls consistently show very strong public support across party lines for expanding this authority.
So, more negotiation. What about the patents?
Patent reform is huge. Ideas aimed at curbing practices like evergreening and those patent thickets we talked about.
Right, the Humira situation.
Exactly. Reforms to encourage the earlier entry of more affordable generics and biosimilars are vital. Things like limiting the number of patents a company can use to block competition, or strengthening the standards for what deserves a patent in the first place.
Makes sense. What else?
Streamlining the FDA approval process for generic drugs, getting them to market faster once patents have expired, is another important step. And addressing those pay-for-delay tactics we mentioned.
Right, stopping brands from paying generics to stay away.
Exactly. Finding ways to prevent or penalize those kinds of anti-competitive agreements.
Okay. What about some of the more, maybe controversial ideas, like importing drugs from Canada or other countries, or even having the government manufacture certain medications directly?
Those are certainly options that get discussed, then they pop up in policy debates regularly. Currently, the widespread import of prescription drugs from other countries with lower prices is largely prohibited due to safety and regulatory concerns cited by the FDA and industry.
Well, people talk about changing that.
Yes, there are ongoing debates about potentially revising those regulations, perhaps allowing importation from specific trusted countries like Canada, provided stringent safety standards can be maintained. Government manufacturing is another idea.
The government making drugs.
Potentially, yes, particularly in situations where there's a market failure, maybe a lack of generic competition for an old but essential drug, or during critical drug shortages. It seems a potential lever, although it raises its own set of pretty significant economic and logistical questions.
Definitely sounds complex. And we've also heard about things like value-based pricing, the idea of linking the cost of a drug to how well it actually works for patients.
Yes, value-based pricing and outcome-based contracts are gaining traction. The concept is that payments to drug manufacturers would be tied, at least in part, to the drug achieving its intended health outcomes in real-world use.
So if the drug doesn't work as well as claimed, the manufacturer gets paid less.
That's the basic idea. It aims to align the price more closely with the actual value delivered to patients and the healthcare system. It's complex to implement, but it's being explored.
And finally, transparency, shining a light on the PBMs and rebates.
Absolutely. Greater transparency throughout the drug pricing chain, particularly concerning the role of PBMs and the rebates they negotiate, could be very helpful. Understanding where the money is actually going could identify potential areas for savings and make the system more accountable.
This has been a really insightful and, I have to say, somewhat sobering look at a really complex issue. To try and wrap this up, what are the key takeaways you'd like our listeners to remember from this deep dive?
I think the main thing is that the high cost of prescription drugs in the U.S. isn't due to just one thing. It's a multifaceted problem with deep roots in our unique patent system, the historical lack of government negotiating power, various market dynamics, including the role of intermediaries like PBMs, and, yes, the profit objectives of the industry.
And these aren't just abstract issues.
Not at all. These inflated prices have significant ethical and very personal consequences. They directly impact your ability, potentially, to access needed medications, forcing many Americans to make incredibly difficult, sometimes dangerous, decisions about their health and finances.
It really hits home when you consider how these big systemic issues directly influence whether you can afford the medication you or a family member depends on. It can jeopardize your health, your financial stability, everything.
Exactly. And it leads us, I think, to this final, maybe provocative thought for you, our listener, to consider. Given that the U.S., through its higher drug prices, effectively subsidizes a substantial portion of global pharmaceutical research and development.
Which is the argument we often hear. We pay more so the world gets new drugs.
Right. But accepting that premise for a moment, is the current system, with its extreme costs and access barriers, truly serving the best interests of American patients? What fundamental shifts might be necessary to create a healthcare landscape that's not only innovative but also equitable and affordable for everyone here at home?
Yep.
It really prompts a crucial reflection, doesn't it, on the core values and the ultimate objectives of our healthcare system. What are we prioritizing?